right, good late afternoon, early evening. My name is Daisy Williams. I'm the Director of Undergraduate Studies for the Department of Architecture and also one of your faculty members here in the Department of Architecture. It is my pleasure to introduce to you this evening our speaker this evening, Robert A. Clarke. Robert Clarke is our first Wilson W. Smith III visiting faculty fellow in our Design for Spatial Justice program. Clarke is a designer. Robert Clarke is a designer, educator, and theorist whose work lives at the intersection between culture, identity, and aesthetics. Robert is a Brooklyn native, a proud Brooklyn native, I've learned, and a graduate of the Master of Architecture program at Roger Williams University. Before joining the faculty here at the University of Oregon in his fellowship position, Robert held posts as a visiting critic at the New York City Tech and as a research fellow at New Lab under the supervision of Dr. Mitchell Joachim. He also worked for many years at architecture firms in Brooklyn, Austin, Shanghai, and Los Angeles, firms that include HOK, Terraform One, Gensler, and ArchiUnion. Robert's office, his own practice is RALX. And it critiques mainstream practices and design methodologies within the discourse of architecture and design. Robert's work at RALX is a cultural investigation into the identity and place that aims to uncover and explore novel methodologies that speculate on how one can interject specific omitted histories and traditions into contemporary aesthetics, forms, and functions, creating new languages from lost or neglected design vocabularies. He has translated this work here at the University of Oregon in some very unique ways in the classes that he's taught. Specifically in the fall, he led a Rebuilding Cornerstones 584 studio on Black domesticity. And in that studio, it investigated African-American living rituals through the lens of the single-family house and questioned how to appropriately design for these highly distinct cultural nuances, while understanding and contributing to a specific design aesthetic for the Albina district in Portland that expresses the historical and cultural moments that define their community. This studio not only explored the social conditions of Black space, but questioned how to amplify it through linguistics, design, and economy. And in working with Robert, one of the things I've enjoyed most about his studio is his forward way of addressing aesthetics at the forefront, formal ideas, conceptual ideas, and really gets to the root of the question of why are we designing what we're designing. And his second studio offering here at the University of Oregon, his studio, the Super Bodega Studio, back to that Brooklyn origin, right? Explored transformational methodologies that address the phenomenon known as the bodega. And it created a cultural institution that was translated into an oasis that might offer self-sustaining organic food alternatives. What I thought most interesting about that studio is he took the typology and operationalized that typology as a conceptual engine for rethinking community, rethinking agriculture in an urban context, and also rethinking identity. In his current seminar offering this term, his course called The Culture's Art, Design, and Philosophy examines and studies and unpacks the natural human phenomenon known as culture. This class includes students from across the majors on campus, not just design students, and they look at more specifically Black American culture as it relates to artistic creation. In this class, they focus their view from the start of the Harlem Renaissance to this current contemporary moment. Culture is treated as a communal phenomenon in which a group of people with a shared ethnic background develop their own ideology, standards, and way of life in isolation. It's been a joy and a pleasure to be here and enjoy the kind of courses that Robert has brought into our community. I can say personally, one of the most meaningful moments I had in a design studio critique was in one of his studios, where our very own Wilson Smith, very infamous alum of our program, saw in the studio reflected back to him his own Black American culture, his own family rituals, his own family traditions in the work that a student produced in our studio. And he himself commented on how unique that was for him as a Black man. And so for me, that was incredibly meaningful, and I think it was incredibly meaningful for the students. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over so we can hear a little bit more about Robert's ideas and concepts and theories and some of the investigations that he's made along the way. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for being here tonight, but also throughout this academic year. Great.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. So I'm mic'd up, so my voice might sound a little weird, so bear with me. So I just have some opening comments before this presentation. I just have a few shout outs that I want to do. So in my kind of work, it's never a solo endeavor. It takes a village. So without these wonderful people, many of these discoveries would have never been made. So firstly, I want to shout out Jack Travis, which has been a huge mentor of mine. He has been theorizing Black aesthetics from about the 1980s. And he's really one of the godfathers of the movement, along with Craig Wilkins. I'd also like to shed some light on Wilson Smith. And without him, my position really wouldn't be possible. Damar Matthews, an architect and designer out of Los Angeles, whose thesis work really shed a light on things that I should have been investigating. Of course, Daisy Williams, my faculty mentor here, who's been quite insightful in relationship to my transition to pedagogy. We have Cleo and Kayeen, who's without them, my work in terms of my relationship to the albino community and some of the studios wouldn't have been possible. And last but not least, to the SAE leadership and letting me do the things that I want to do and think a little differently. Special thanks to Aaron Moore, Michael Zareski, and Dean Parr. And so the topics that I'm going to talk about has to do with my intellectual project. And it's kind of an old idea, but what is really the main concept of what I'm trying to generate? And so my main question surrounds Black architecture and Black aesthetics and what that means in relationship to a North American context. And so my studio, my pedagogy, my research aims to uncover hidden expressions, aesthetics, and architecture that are derived from the Black American experience. Throughout the history of the world, many cultures have manifested their own architectures that have been specific to their customs and traditions. My work and my practice speculates how one can correct this flagrant cultural omission, artistic omission, within the discourse of architecture. The projects and the work that I'll be showing today will explore novel methodologies that investigates how one can interject African American culture into architectural forms and motifs. How can we unearth a recognizable aesthetic that expresses lost histories, current histories, and cultural norms that are specific to African American culture? And once starting to generate this question, I started to form this diagram. Needs a little bit of work, but it was really the conception of my office. How do we quantify Black culture? What does it look like from the point of the American? I'm not just talking about North American, but the Americas, the Caribbean, South America. What does it look like? And in the conception and generation of this concept, this visual concept, I started to look at African X and what does that mean? And in terms of our displacement, what are the customs, cultures, and traditions that displacement has generated? And how does that then manifest within our identity? How does traditions, cuisine, linguistics, fashion, music, religion, locality, racism, how do all of those things shape Black culture? How has it evolved Black culture? How has it been recognizably personified in other artistic fields? So we started to look at, my office, my classes, start to look at methodologies of Black artists and how they have employed a Black expression that are specific to African American ways of being. One of the main artists that we start to look at is the work of Ernie Barnes and how he chronicled his personal experiences with football, music, dance, love, education, and his relationship to the South. While it's hard to resist centering Ernie Barnes's work within a pop cultural frame, This focus overlooks the importance of his Southern roots, and that goes back to the locality of this diagram. How has that influenced his identity? In his work, he tries to draw connections between diverse Black communities. You see the colorful clothing, the expressive movement, the rhythms and gestures that are inviting. You see the reflection of communal dignity that are experienced within the African-American community. And then we start to juxtaposition that with other artists and what their representations and what their reflections on pop culture, fashion, history, music, art, and how to recognizably create that. All while thinking about now, how can we then generate this into a type of architecture? How can architecture, how can art become a mirror of society? How could we interject these type of histories, identities into architecture that has historically negated these types of narratives? So when we look at the artists of Famu, which is particularly interesting in terms of the way he highlights the way of being, dressing, that is recognizable to many African Americans. They see themselves in the art, a space that has traditionally neglected this premise. And so how do we also bring that into architecture is my main premise of my investigation. And looking even further into Wali's work, he looks at art as almost a critique and addresses the blatant inequality of history, but also suggests the presence of hip hop culture by juxtapositioning European portraiture with modern day, street smart African-American men and women. Wali also identifies a stereotype depiction of Black masculinity and power, at the same time underscoring the omissions of well-established canon of Western portraiture. So my office also looks, how can we create a discourse that underscores these omissions in architectural terms? And we're also looking at the variety of a Black expression in fine art, highlighting not only street culture, but looking towards a linguistic pattern. So we just position this, the work of Wiley's work and the work of Basquiat, looking at different cultural linguistics and how to draw from cultural linguistics into a type of Black aesthetic. The work of Strickland looks at the everyday, highlights the life nuances of the African-American experience, the everyday interactions that define us, that give us our identity, no longer showing the regal, but the ordinary in such a recognizable way. Again, it's almost like one is feeling like they're looking into a memory glass. And so we also highlight the relationship between the personified regality of Blackness and then the personified everyday of Blackness, and how that generates a type of expression that is recognizable, that one sees itself in the work. And how do we bring that into architecture? Not only looking at our icons, but looking at the everyday. And so many of these questions were at the forefront of my intellectual project. How can this act of storytelling generate a recognizable style or styles of architecture that resonate with Black communities? One of our first projects that looks towards this is our Hollywood project, which won an honorable mention in the Los Angeles Low Rise competition. Our proposal examines the Hollyhock House, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. We aim to highlight themes of cultural appropriation. We aim to show how the Hollyhock House exemplifies design colonialism at its finest. We use design as a critique on architectural canon. And so when first formulating this project, we looked at specifically Black architecture, more specifically the shotgun, and how we could turn that into a framework, like the Mason Domino. How can we turn it into a type of essence, a cultural essence that becomes a framework that we can then work off of? And so we wanted to create a type of FUBU approach, for us, by us, a style derived of a Black aesthetic, developed for the culture and by the culture, not just an appropriation. So we started to look at different linguistic patterns, and we also started to look at different types of ornamentation that talked about different histories, specific histories, Black histories. And so we also started to look at bandana print and what kind of histories and generations that could bring, talking about the original formations of many gangs to combat over-policing. And how can then we turn that into an architectural expression that talks about these multiple histories that have been omitted? The jury stated that they were impressed by our narrative's critique on colonialism in historic Los Angeles architecture, and for its ideas of advancing the development of a Black aesthetic by remaking the Hollyhock House without a shred of nostalgia. So, on this bottom part here, we actually ghosted the Hollyhock House and completely ignored it, and had this Black aesthetic project float above it. And so we negated a lot of the hyper stylization of the Frank Lloyd Wright Mayan revival, and juxtapositioned it with this and created different motifs that acted as place finding elements and light elements that lived within the structural slab. And so, highlighted in this plan, we started to create a module, a structural element that highlights the plan metrics of the shotgun, and created a module. And within those modules, then we created social spaces. And within those social spaces, those are where the narratives live, as a type of imprint and ornamentation that leads you down the project and organizes it. And so then we started to juxtaposition that with our ornamentation of a Black aesthetic versus the stylized Frank Lloyd Wright Mayan revival aesthetic. And so these aesthetics were designed by Black designers versus what we already have here, which is not so, right? And so when we talk about themes of cultural appropriation, when you're talking about a style and a culture, it should be by the culture and for the culture, right? And not really a ripoff. And so this presentation we felt was a little aggressive, but it was one of the proposals that we want. So we started to use our design as a heavy critique on historic architecture. And so in terms of the next project that I'm bringing you in, we start to create our own formalized language and create our own motifs that talk about similar histories as a sort of timeline, a design timeline that keeps us grounded in what we're trying to talk about. So we create a type of bibliography on our architecture of the histories that we're tracking. So this is another different type of banana print that becomes the facade element that talks about, again, these different types of histories that relate to over-policing in relationship to Los Angeles culture. And how do these ornaments then create a type of expression that is natively Black? And so back into the creation of space, we started to create our own type of plan between the hybrids. So we have an open floor plan where the living room lives, and then we have a mix or deconstructed shotgun where actually the circulation lives, and then we have the bedrooms. So it's a mix between a new type of shotgun and an open floor plan to create a new type of holistic architectural American expression. And so in terms of how we're forming our architecture, we're critiquing about the histories of form making, of space making, and then also imprinting on that to create a type of visual expression and spatial expression. And so we're creating similar story timelines, similar imprints, so we can, again, track our history of our investigations. And you can see here, we start to think about also the American gable and how to then transform that American gable. So we started to look at indigenous sculpture and created these crowns on top of the architecture that links also back to African histories. So it's almost like a collage of different types of histories and different types of ideas that create identity. Identity doesn't come from one place, but it comes from a collation of different situations and stimuli. And how can then we interject that into architecture? And so now my office starts to develop not only past histories, but current histories, and then start to speculate about future histories. So one of our speculations is about graffiti and how to turn linguistics into a space-defining element. Graffiti, being one of the 5 pillars of hip hop, is intrinsically married to African-American culture. Informally, it already exists as a projection and form, an act of tagging identity. But how could it be more? How could we create spaces derived from strokes of movement going back to Barnes? How can we create a different type of expression that talks about life histories, life rituals that are specific to African-American experience? Would that style natively be Black? Would it be recognizable? And more importantly, would it be accepted? So all of these conditions and strategies we're thinking through design. One of these explorations, both of these explorations, was done by a designer in my office. And we're looking at graffiti as a space-defining element at the same time as a projection. And what type of urban environments would that create? And then we also start to think about, what does post-shade, what does wall thickness, what does circulation have to do in the play of that? What does colors mean? And how does colors also link to a type of key or does space-defining element that means something else? And so all of these questions, we continue to explore. This is a project in Chicago that I worked with Elena. And we started to think about graffiti as not only a space-defining element, but as a mantra. And what does a mantra mean? And so we developed this "We Are Here" mantra. And then we started to figure out, how can we develop different types of architectural spaces that are inherently Black, not just in the linguistics, but the spatial dynamics. So we have this, let's see here. We have this elongated porch, right? That brings you from the streetscape and into the architecture. And once you're into the architecture, then you feel the space of these different types of movements. That brings you from the dining to the living to the bedroom, and then this termination into the alleyway. So it really talks about a movement that is non-linear, but dances, juxtaposition, it shakes, it jives, and it talks about different types of musical histories. And how does that then influence space making, not only in the architectural form, but also the architectural representation, the architectural colors, the architectural shape. What does all of that mean? We start to question all of these things in my office and research. And so that frame of thinking was brought into pedagogy. And so this studio investigates African-American living rituals through the lens of the single-family house and how to appropriately design for these highly distinct cultural nuances while understanding and contributing to a specific design aesthetic for the Albina district that expresses historical and cultural moments that define their community. The studio not only explores the social conditions of Black space, but how to amplify it through linguistics, design, and economy. So you see certain themes start to reappear in our investigations. And so we had an outline of 4 assignments. One was basically a linguistics assignment, right? How to develop a type of pictograph chart that talks about Albina's landmarks, historical moments, and traditions, and use this as a matrix for generating architecture. And then we go to the critique. We go from the linguistics to the critique. We critique historical, classical architecture that has been codified through a Eurocentric lens, and how to break that lens and bring in other cultures and other narratives to create their own type of classical style. And then the next assignment goes into the specifics of Black space, and we investigate a porch And how do linguistics and this critique then play a role in creating a hybrid type of aesthetic brought into the porch, culminating in the house? So I'm going to show some student projects, student works that have been manifested through these lines of inquiry. And so a lot of these projects here start to talk about linguistics, they start to talk about histories, they start to talk about identity. And so this particular piece here really talks about the South American identity, is borrowed from the South American calendar, and how does identity and fingerprint and movement and space all create an expression. You can even see it in the types of lines and crochet that's derived. It's a mix between a type of primitive move, type of contemporary move. And how do we borrow these type of linguistics in terms of focusing our investigation into architectural space and thought? This particular project here talks about the various scales of Blackness. So we created a gradient chart. And then it also talks about the different scales of Protestant religion that lives within the Black community. So we start to talk about, again, different historical movements, different identities, and the various scales of identity that lives within the Black community through graphical means. We also talk about the relationship between the recognizable and the decipherable, and how do you need certain cultural cues to get information. And so some of these are deciphered and some of them are recognizable. This particular exercise is recognizable. So you get to see, the fists of empowerment. You also get to see the paws of the Black Panther. You get to see the Malcolm X glasses, and they tell a total history of different types of cultures and histories that then interface with the Black experience. And again, we go between the decipherable and the recognizable, and this talks about hair culture, this talks about African culture, and this bleeds in and talks about then African American culture, and then it bleeds in and talks about specific Black identities. It talks about, again, a total history, the total of compartments, the part to the whole that makes up identity, and how that could be graphically organized. Moving from there, we go to the critique. How do we create different types of styles that are more inclusive to different types of identities and narratives? This particular project here talks about not only the different types of African masks, but different types of churches that exist in Portland, decomposes them and recomposes them into a new type of aesthetic, new type of ordering system, structural system that lives between the ornament and the form. Again, bringing back all of these complex ideas about identity and what it means in relationship to Black identity. Is it closer tied to the continent of Africa? Is it closer tied to our displacement countries? Is it closer tied to our locality? And what does that mean? And what does that generate in terms of our imprint in linguistics? And how do we see that through our formwork and architecture? This project was particularly interesting because we, again, look at the work of Barnes. So some of the work looks at identity, some of the work is intuitive, and some of it is analytical. And this project here is quite analytical in terms of dissecting Ernie Barnes, talking about different movement and expressions, and then how to then turn that language and knowledge into a new type of structural order, manifestation, and expression. Moving forward, all of those investigations about linguistics, form, order, criticism of canon, how does that then move into Black space? How do you then create Black space? We looked at living rituals, how one lives in space, and then bringing that type of critique, that type of linguistics, and creating new types of expression, both futuristic and primitive. This project culminated in a house. How do we turn all of these identity type of information, identity types of generators into new expressions and new ways of creating space? This particular project looked at djembe drums and figured out different types of ways music can be used as an organizing space creator in terms of bringing people in. And so even with the poche starts to change and create its own expression and life of its own, and talks about the free-flowing nature of space, music, sound, and life rituals. This project here looks at hair culture and how hair culture can start to become a space-defining element, a type of diagram, a type of idea of how to organize life rituals. And then again, you start to see these types of exercises live in a multitude of places, not only in the wall thickness, not only in the way you move through space, but also in the expression. And so in this particular project, the porch is used as the nucleus. And from the porch, you radially flow through the architecture. Again, looking at the work of Barnes, how do we create different types of motifs, structures, orders, space-defining elements that are recognizably tied to Black culture? How do these elements then generate space? How does one live in them? And how does it become familiar to the community you're designing for? This project was a merge between the Ernie Barnes exercise and Craftsman Home found in Albina. And what type of new expression does the locality and the history, the merge, the confluence of those ideas create? Lastly, this project that I want to show, again, investigates the porch, but using the porch as a space-defining organizer, and it's hidden within the architecture. And what then becomes a reverse porch is this community house that people from the neighborhood could then come in, not see your more intimate house, meet people, it becomes a social activator. Once you enter that social activator, you come to the porch. And from the porch, you have this space, this interior house that then the family lives in. So it also talks about phasing different type of community activities in a very particular way, in a safe way. And then all of these walls that are perforated hide and protect these type of sacred spaces. All of these investigations about how to create space, how to create Black space, talking about identity, and what does that mean in a graphical sense, in a space-making sense, is at the core of my pedagogy, at the core of my question and my intellectual project. And these are the works that I've done with students here at U of O. And that will be the culmination of the work that I'll be showing today.
So thank you, Robert. What we'd like to do is to open it up for questions, and I'll help kind of field questions as Robert answers them. So any questions or comments, observations? Question in the front.
Hi, thank you. I'm wondering, I can see this use of icons, right, and form, how form is derived from other forms. But I wonder if you're ever thinking about movement and migration and how that I don't know, more temporary inhabitation of space and place might fit into your project.
Yeah, so a lot of the questions in that in particularly, we look into the nuance of that. So you're talking about the art of displacement and how that then infiltrates identity and how that manifests in a way of architecture. So in the previous project that that I was talking about, talking about displacement, this house particularly was based in albino. And so we talk about how a lot of Black communities have a silhouette and imprint on that silhouette. So we use the silhouette of displacement or what we already have based on a locality, and then interject identity by linguistics, by histories, and formulate a type of hybrid expression. And so that's similarly what you see here. It's really not talking about a specific, if you saw kind of like the diagram that we had there, is about talking about a confluence of different things that then edify our identity. So many times we don't talk about a specificity of a specific identity, but we talk about multiple identities, multiple stories that create a specific experience.
Questions. And Robert, if we have more questions, you might have to summarize what the question is so that those who are listening in.
Oh, okay.
Just in case they can.
Cool.
One of the questions that I had, oh, yeah.
Oh, you gotta jump out there.
Professor mode, I'll just jump right in there. Okay.
Think of the block process. Just read it back to say, Google program was like, what did you identify or what did the designers of this particular space identify?
So this was particularly interesting. It wasn't in the narrative, but we started to look at different ways Black people inhabit homes. So we looked particularly at the continent of Africa, and then we also looked at the diaspora and how people, acclimate to homes in the Americas. And then based on those type of life rituals, we generated the program from life rituals. So communal cooking, if some cultures have communal bathing, and all of those situations. So in the next house, talking about communal bathing, we have actually like an outhouse that's separated from the architecture that talks about also that type of life rituals. So we break down life rituals and create the program from life rituals. That's specific to identity.
Hi, Robert. Thank you for the talk. It's great to see the work. And as Daisy said, it's been fantastic to have you here this year. Thank you for being here. One of the conversations you and I have had in the sort of group of people who are working on Black aesthetic and Black architecture, that there is this difference of approach about whether Black architecture in the US reflects Black American culture or African culture. Can you speak to that and your perspective on that, and also whether that is changing if you're continuing to explore this work?
Yeah, so Michael is alluding to a conversation about the African American as a specific identity that's divorced or kind of divorced from the identity of African. And what does that mean? And so a lot of times I think of the North American context as a tribe. Like if the African American community had a type of tribe, what type of architecture would that generate, right? And there would then be multiple different types of identities and tribes that live within that. And so we've been at a place for quite a number of years, and we have created different types of cultures that exist within that, and that's reflected in art, that's reflected in music, that's reflected in so many different varieties except architecture. So it is real, there is a real definition. It has just not been generated in architecture. And my question is why? And then my question is also how. So it's that kind of defiant mark. If you talk about jazz, if you talk about hip hop, if you talk about Barnes's work, it's specifically African-American and it's recognizable. So there is a recognizable difference and it's quantifiable. And now how to do that in architecture is my question.
So, like, what do you kind of refer back to in this talk was a lot of painters, hip hop artists. I'm wondering, are there people building things like this right now, or is this just kind of all academic at the present moment?
So there is work that's built. So there's a Professor Cook, he was at Syracuse, but he also talked about this type of exploration is at the forefront. So there's about maybe 6, anytime I talk to, say, academics, and they're asking who I'm citing, there's only about 6 books and articles combined that talk about African-American architecture and identity as a generator. And in terms of if this is being built, there are a few architects I could list you to. Jack Travis is one of them. Craig Wilkins is one of them. But particularly in a Black aesthetic, it's very few. And so this is why this is my line of research. And this type of expression is fluent in many other different types of artistic expressions, except architecture. And so is a lot of these things, or are a lot of these things being built? No, but that's the problem. And that's, you know, in terms of pedagogy, practice, and research, that's why I'm trying to correct some of these problems with many contemporaries of mine. If you look at the work of Jermaine Barnes, if you look at the work of Tamar Matthews, if you look at the work of Kevin Sherrod. So there are contemporaries out there, but it's a process, and architecture takes some time.
A lot of these projects are single-family homes. I was wondering if in urban housing, it's starting to trend towards multi-family, multi-family units or larger complexes. And I wondered how some of these ideas could also be, or which of the ideas, the communal or the water, those sort of ideas could transcend into multi-family housing as well.
So we particularly looked at single family house as a way to build equity and a way to build wealth generation. And how to then, with that type of device, create those communal moments. So in this particular project, you have the community house, you have the porch that are communal devices. But again, how do we create wealth in these communities? It's also important. And that's through home ownership.
In all of these explorations and articles and other architects or researchers cited, have you been able to coalesce a type of typologies of form that could be applied to other programs, basically architecture, kind of like she's asking about in the sense that these explorations definitely cited different things as the form differences. Have you been able to coalesce like typologies or form that we could probably make a reference and say, well, this works this way. We could use this form to express this type of architecture?
No, currently our investigations reject that. We look at a form that is tied to a type of cultural investigation and a type of life ritual that then becomes a hybrid that then generates the form. So the form doesn't dictate the life ritual dictates the form. And that manifests and generates differently through different populations, through different communities. So we're creating a methodology, but we're not creating a typology.
Where else can we find an aggregation of all of this?
You mean the work here that I'm showing?
Apart from this work, assuming, let's say, after all of this was done, it was discovered that if we applied this life occurrences, basically generate this type of form, if we apply this other thing, like graffiti, this type of form, it's definitely free, I get that. But then where do we find, like, if we're going to start like from the top, like, well, this is a way to start to get into this line of thinking. Where can we find like all this like aggregated apart from what you're showing us here?
Yeah, so there's different outlets right now. My contemporaries, again, we're using different vehicles through academia. So trying to build journals, we're trying to do built work. We're trying to do installations. So again, if you look at the work of Jermaine Barnes, he's a Rome Prize Fellow. He's done, Lexus exhibition in Miami. So you could see a lot of his works, again, a colleague of mine, Kevin Sherrod, he's building a lot, he's out of Gainesville, Los Angeles. You could see Cook's work, he's also written a book on hip hop architecture. So again, it's gonna take a village. It's not just me or another architect, it's gonna take a real organization of our group in terms of defining our aesthetic and what that means. So it's really asking more questions than answering.
Robert, that was an amazing talk. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it and thinking about how we can start to think about different typologies and different virtues. And I loved what you were saying about African Americans being kind of like a separate tribe. So I guess I'm asking. So I worked with Anton, you know Anton,
Yeah.
and a studio in LA on Destination Crenshaw in Los Angeles. And one thing that we had a really hard time, the ethos and the objective of the project is Blackness in the light. But a big problem that we had is that there just aren't that many diverse voices in landscape architecture or architecture.
Mhm.
And so we're constantly running into this problem of what is appropriation and what is respect and how do we actually get more diverse voices kind of like at the table? I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about appropriation. And so we've been having, well, me and Cleo have been having discussion about appropriation. And so specifically, African Americans have been displaced, but through that displacement, we picked up many cultures, right? However, a lot of those cultures are cited. So if you're trying to remix something, you always cite, this is kind of a remix off of this. So whenever we talk, or particularly when we have projects or my office, we always cite where we're pulling our references from. I think that's been kind of neglected, and how to create a type of annotated bibliography through form. And so our way of doing that has been through ornamentation on form. And you can have recognizable links to specifics that we've pulled. But I think referencing negates the appropriation. I think we all borrow from each other, but not to erase the fact that we're borrowing is important.
Somebody online, raise their hand.
There's a question there. I hear you mentioning that collective or communal nature of many lifeways in African American communities were taken into account, even central to the design aesthetic. I've also heard there seems to be a question about home ownership and wealth creation. I wonder if any attention has been given to the tradition of cooperation and collective entrepreneurship, governance, and wealth building. Oh, so why question? So in terms of the communal nature of almost everything as a life ritual, that has been looked at, not particularly in this project, but the work that I've been doing with Cleo and Albina Vision on how to change governance and policy to not create a type of crab in the barrel identity or manifestation. And so those investigations are really starting to boil now, but there hasn't been a vehicle for us to explore that currently.
One of the things I would ask, and maybe build off of the previous question in a way, is that having been able to sit in on some of these studio reviews, what's striking to me is that by loosening conventional ideas about form, as it relates to type, really type, has opened up a space for reconsidering some of the political elements of space. So when I look at a house like this, and I consider it that it's supposed to be in a lot, it's a single family residence lot in Albina, it has all sorts of implications about access, ownership, permission, even, and so I'm curious about whether or not you'll go back and reread some of the projects you've engaged students with that kind of question in mind, where trying to acknowledge a very formal language might have been the directive or might have been the goal, but I'm wondering if that formal language turned around and informed, well, formal language plus ritual, turned around and informed, those outcomes turned around and informed maybe conventional or normative ways of thinking about single family organizations and neighborhoods, or whatever the typology is. Think about the sort of super data studio that you did and rethinking ideas of what that means about urban farming, ideas about what that means about commerce, community, et cetera. So I'm curious to see if you have any input.
Yeah, so a lot of these projects and even my work typically right now is to critique and be a catalyst for change. And so a lot of these are to spark ideas of what could be. And so, for example, when this presentation was given in Portland, a lot of people from Albina Vision came. And so when we're talking about ideas of identity in relationship to past, current, and future, and what would that look like as a new type of expression or borrowed expressions from history as a type of architectural generator, that specific group was like, that's exactly what we want to start building. So it's really, this work really acts as a catalyst. A lot of times architects, if we don't build, we think our work doesn't employ change, but there has to be a catalyst that then generates change.
Any other additional questions or any others from the Zoom?
Let me just read this first, sorry. Okay, so this one basically talks about appropriation and have I come across any examples that have erased specific histories, and was there a way to bring back to light these hidden origins? And so one of the first projects that I showed, let's see here. Yep. So one of the first projects I showed, we started to look at graffiti and bandana print, and we lightly touched on it, but we started to talk about how organizations, specifically gangs, a lot of them formulated through the act of trying to protect neighborhoods from over-policing. And so we start to talk about the original histories that have been erased by history and more harsh histories, and negate the origins and the intent of certain organizations that have been brought down by external factors. And so a lot of these also talk about hidden histories, but they're not seen in every project. Every project talks about multiple histories, but we also need a way to curate them to have a direct type of relationship to what we want to talk about in particular.
I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Well, they're coming like hot fire.
And let's see this. Oh, okay.
No, just thank you.
Thank you. Well, with that, I don't think I saw any questions. I want to thank you again, Robert, for your lecture and for your time with us. And we hope that we look forward to sort of seeing more outcomes in this term as we finalize it.
Thanks everyone for showing up.